Hello everyone, welcome back to this video series on clinical SAS programming. In this video, we will see how to create a macro for study day variables in ADaM datasets. So the name of the macro that we'll be creating is ADaM underscore make underscore study day. So this macro has few parameters and the names are date. The first parameter is date, and here we are trying to use it to name the analysis date variable for which we want to calculate the study day. For example, ASTDT, AENDT, or ADT, etc. And the second parameter is used named as ref date, and it is used to specify the name of the reference date variable which is considered as day one. Say for example, TRTSTT. And similarly, sometimes what can happen is apart from TRTSDT, we may have some analysis reference date which would be considered as day one. So we can specify the name of that variable in ref date parameter. And the third parameter is study day, and this is used to specify the name of the variable in which the calculated study day has to be stored. Say for example, ASTDY if we are creating study day for ASTDT, and ADY if we are creating a study day for ADT. In this lesson, we will also see how to use append is equal to SAS autos is equal to option to call the autocall macros. So we'll also use the previously created ADaM make datetime macro to create numeric dates from character date variables. So again, this video is part of the macro series. So I'll create a separate playlist for macros so you can watch the previous videos in the playlist. Now let us move to the SAS session and then see what we are trying to do here. As I mentioned that we will be seeing how to make use of append is equal to SAS autos is equal to option to specify the location of the macro which we have already written. So mauto source is used to specify that the macros written and placed in the external location have to be used in this session. And then here we are specifying the location of that particular uh, macros here in append is equal to SAS autos is equal to option. So let me just execute this line of code, and then I will also show you the location where I have placed the macro. So here I have placed the ADaM make datetime macro which we have created as part of the previous video. So I have placed the macro in this location, and one thing to note is that if we want to make a macro as autocall macro, the name of the file and the name of the macro within it should be the same. So the name of the macro we created was ADaM make datetime, and the file name is also ADaM make datetime. So that way only the mauto source option and SAS autos will work. If you give a different name to the file, but the macro has a different name within it, so autocall macros will not be called or will not be able to use them. So now let's come back to the session and then see. So here we'll be first seeing how to create study day variable manually without using any macro. So I am using AE as an example here. So in the first step, I have my SDTM AE, for example, as an input. I have USUBJD, AE STDTC, AE NDTC, and TRTSDT here. So TRTSDT is our reference start date for this example. So we have seen in the previous video how to make use of or how to create a variable macro to convert ISO dates in character format to numeric date, time, and date time values. So I am making use of that macro to create ASTDT, ASTTM, and ASTDTM for AE-STDTC. Similarly, for end date, I am using the same macro to create the numeric versions of date, time, and date time value. And then how we actually calculate study day. So this line is the basic code for study day creation. So the first thing that we are trying to do here is we are checking if both the variables of interest. So we are calculating study day based on treatment start date. So we are checking whether both the start date and treatment start date have a non-missing value present. So what does nmiss do is nmiss checks the number of arguments passed to it on a particular row. It returns the number of variables with a missing value on it. So here if we are passing two variables, it will check whether on a particular row how many uh, variables have missing value in it. Say for example, if both TRTSDT and ASTDT is missing, so it would return a value of 2. Let's say if TRTSDT is present but ASTDT is missing, so it will return a value of 1. So it is actually counting the number of arguments which has a missing value on that particular row. So what if both TRT-SDT and ASTDT is present? So then there are no variables with missing values on that particular row. It actually returns 0. So we are checking for the presence of a value in both TRT-SDT and ASTDT using nmiss function, and it will return a value of 0 only when both of them are non-missing. So we are using this condition of is equal to 0 because it will be only 0 when both of these are present. And then we are creating this new variable ASTDY by checking the difference of ASTDT and TRT-SDT. And then here we are making use of this piece of code which actually uh, gets resolve to 1 or 0. So study day variable, what we generally do is if any date of interest is on or after treatment start date, we would get the difference and then add 1, and if it is less than, then we would add a difference of 0. So here I have previously created a video clearly explaining how this actually gets resolved, but I'll just quickly cover. So every condition in SAS gets evaluated to true or false, and every true will become 1 and the false it resolves to 0. So as per the requirement, what we need to do is for in all the cases where the ASTDT is greater than TRT-SDT, so we need to get the difference and then add 1 to that difference. Otherwise, we need to add a nothing or add 0 to it. So this condition will become true only when ASTDT is greater than or equal to TRT-SDT. So in that case, it would return a value of 1. So this actually becomes ASTDT minus TRT-SDT plus 1. And in all the cases where ASTDT this condition is not met, it would resolve to 0. The else condition would be something like less than ASTDT less than TRT-SDT. So in that case, it would resolve to 0. So that instead of writing it in two different statements, we are making use of this shortcut version of the code. So we'll assign the resulting value to ASTDY. So this is how we manually create a study day variable based on two different dates. So let's now see what we are doing in the case of AE and DY. So the only thing that changes is our AE and DT and AE and DY variable in all the other instances where the ASTDTC was used. So here ASTDT is becoming AE and DT and the name of the variable is now AE and DY. In all the instances where we used ASTDT, we are calling it as AE and DT. So now we know that two things change. One is the name of the date variable and the second one is name of the output variable. But we also have a cases wherein the reference date could be different. So we are making this also as a parameter. So three things. First one is reference start date, and the second one is the name of the date variable, and the third one is the name of the output variable into which we want to store the study day. So we will create a macro considering these three variants. So now let us see how we have written the macro. So here, as we discussed, so there were three cases. The first one was reference date could differ and the date could differ and study day could differ. So I am passing them all of those three that could differ as macro variables. So here I am making use of date. Just a second. So date is here, reference date is passed here, and then study day here. So what will happen if I pass a value of ASTD2 to this? So whatever value I specify here for the date parameter, that gets comes and gets replaced here. And then whatever value I give for ref date, so that would be used in this place. And then similarly for study day, so whatever value I give for study day variable would replace this. And then similarly date and ref date would be used here as well. So what would happen if I just try to change it? So we'll see in the step how we are actually creating it, how we are actually using it. So here I am making use of the created macro to create my study day variable. In the first place, what we are doing is, so we are creating numeric variants of start date and end date for AESTDTC and AENDTC. And in the next step, what I am doing is, I am using the newly created macro, which is ADaM underscore make study day, and then creating ASTDY using ASTDT and TRTSDT as reference date. And then I'm creating AENDT, creating AENDY using AENDT and TRTSDT. So we'll see how this actually gets resolved to. So here in the macro, what we have said, I am passing the value of ASTDT here for date variable. So in all the instances where ampersand date is used, which means the value for the parameter date would get replaced with AST dt. So how many instances do we have? We have 3. So in all the places where we have date, ampersand date, it would get replaced with AST dt. And then the second one which we have specified is ref date, which for which we are passing the value of TRTSDT. So in wherever we have used ampersand ref date, that symbol gets overwritten with our TRTSDT. So here, and also here. And then we have study day for which we have passed a value of ASTDY. So this study day will now get resolved to ASTDY. So we have written a piece of code with some symbols placed in that. So and for that we are symbols we are passing values at the time of the macro call. So when we call it with ASTDT, TRTSDT and ASTDY, the values get replaced. The names of the variables from this will be used here. So similarly, let's see what happens when we use when we call that for AENDT. So in all the places where ampersand date is present, so it would use AENDT, and then here also it will use AENDT, and here also it will use AENDT. So as TRT SDT we have seen, so it will be using TRT SDT in all the instances where ref date is specified. And then for study day we have used AENDY. So here it will use AENDY. Sorry, it's AENDY. So we are creating this macro with some parameters, and we are calling the macros with different values to it. When we call it with the parameters related to ASTDT, so it will create ASTDY, and when we call it with AENDT related values, so it will create AENDY. So now we got some idea on how this macro actually works. So now let us try to execute the code which we have created manually. So let's examine the log and then see how it is working. So here if we see, so let's open AE01 and see how this is working. So we have ASTDY and AENDY created. So let's also quickly see if this makes sense or not. So our TRT SDT was 5th Jan 2010, and let's examine this ASTDT variable value present on this row. So the ASTDT was 31st December 2010 and 5th Jan 2010. So this is towards the start of the year and this is towards the end of the year. So roughly we should have the difference of around 360. So that seems to be correct. So this is coming fine. So let's also quickly check if AE and DY is making sense. So our treatment start date was 5th Jan and ASTDT on the record for is 31st December and end date is 1st Jan. So it's only one day. The events lasted for one day with 31st December 2010 and 1st Jan 2011. The start date was 361. So if we roughly closely look at the things as it lasted only one day. So as AE and DT was one day after ASTDT, we are also expecting to see that one day difference here in AE and DY as well. So this is working fine. So our normal logic is working fine. And now let us see how our, so let me compile this macro and then in the next instance, let me make use of the macro calls and then create a dataset named AE01M. So I have run the code and then examine the log. So there are no unwanted nodes or errors or warnings. So let's open AE01M and see. So we had 361 and 402 on the fourth record. So we have seen that it was one day difference, 361 and 362. So we got the same result with both the approaches. So now let us do a compare between the manually generated ASTDY and AENDY and also the macro generated this thing. So if everything works fine, so we should see a clean compare result in the output window. So if we see, it says we are comparing AE01 with AE01M. So comparison of AE01 with AE01M. So both the data sets have same number of variables. Number of variables is 12 and 12. Number of observations 6 and 6. And both the data sets have all the variables common. And then if we take a look at the last line, so number of observations with all compared variables equal, so which includes our newly created ASTDY and AENDY. In this case, like both manually derived and the macro based ASTDY and AENDY are actually matching. So we'll now see two more examples on how to make use of this. So here in this instance, I have my LB dataset, so in which LBDTC is present, and again here also we are making use of TRT SDT as the reference date, and then we'll make use of our ADaM make date time variable macro to convert this into ADT, and then use our make study day macro to create study day variable ADY. So let me run this code and then see how this works. So let's quickly examine the log and see if everything is fine. Yes. So let us open LB01 and see if this is actually working fine. So we were able to create ADT using our previously created ADaM make date time and then ADY with the current macro of make study day. So let's also quickly examine if these things make sense or not. Treatment start date is 5th Jan and LBDTC is 4th Jan. So it is one day prior. So when it is only date of interest is prior to the treatment start date, we take the difference of ADT minus TRT SDT, so which is -1. So on the same day, it has to have a value of 1. So it is coming properly. And then for 6th Jan, so it has to be 6 minus 5 plus 1, so it is 2. So the ADY is coming correctly. And then we'll see one more example on its usage. So here we are trying to create TRT SDT variable from RFX STDTC. So I'm making use of ADaM make date time. So RFX STDTC is a character date value, and then I want to use my ADaM make date time value to create TRT SDT using the values present in RFX STDTC. And then similarly for the values present in RFX and DTC, I want to create a variable called TRT ADT. So I'm making use of the make date time macro. And then I want to create the study day variable for corresponding to TRT EDT. So we know that when we use reference start date of treatment, we will know that that will be TRT SDT will be equivalent to 1. But we want to see how long or what is the study day corresponding to the treatment end date here. So let's run this code and then see what is happening. So before that, let's examine DM dataset and then see. So we have two subjects data, RFXSTDTC and RFXCNDTC are present. And then let's open DM01. We have created TRT-SDT and TRT-EDT using ADaM make date time variable. So we were just uh, converting this character date into numeric date for both TRT-SDT and TRT-EDT using XSTDTC and XCNDTC, and then deriving TRT-EDY, the study date corresponding to the treatment end date. So here if we take a look at the value, so it started on 15th and then ended on 30, so which is 30 minus 15 plus 1, so which is 16. So again, here on the second record, 15th Feb is the end date, so which means TRT 15 minus uh, for 1 plus 1, so which will be equivalent to 15 again. So the study day variable corresponding to the treatment end is 16 and 15 for these two subjects. So this is how we can make use of ADaM make study day variable. So some programmers may not prefer creating a separate macro for this because it is only a one line code. But again, so based on the reference date and other things, so you can create a macro and reuse it in places where we want to use them. Thank you for watching and keep learning.